I'm Tom, and I manage the Tolpuddle Martyrs Museum, social media Tolpuddle Tom, and I'm here in St John's Churchyard in Tolpuddle by the grave of James Hammett. And in just a little while, we're going to be back here for the wreath-laying, a very kind of profound and important moment in the festival. But first of all, we're just going to go over to Kathy Claxton, who's going to actually talk a bit about James Hammett, who was her great-great-great-great-grandfather.
This is the story of my great-great-great-great-grandfather, James Hammett, one of the Tolpuddle Martyrs, and the only one to return to the Dorset village of Tolpuddle, where he's buried. I'd started my family tree in 2002, prompted by the birth of my first grandchild, Angel. This wasn't as easy as I'd imagined. I was raised by my great-grandmother Fanny from the age of 6 near Shaftesbury. Her strong Dorset accent had me looking for Harriet Emmett as her mother. And in 2006, I was contacted by Sally McMahon, a Hammett researcher and a mine of information. I was completely blown away to learn that I was descended from this brave man. I was really puzzled that my great-grandmother hadn't shared any of this history with me, as we were very close. She shared many tales of her childhood and struggles in life, but nothing of her great-grandfather James. Why hadn't she told me? I felt hurt somehow. As time went by, I learned more and more about the martyr's story and discovered the pact that was made between the 6 men, that this part of their history would not be passed down to their grandchildren and would remain buried. I make no apology for being the first Hammett grandchild to break that pact. My admiration for this man knows no bounds. James was born into the poor life of farm labourers in Tolpuddle on the 11th of December 1811 and was baptised in St John's Parish Church on the 3rd of May 1812. At 17 he had his first brush with the law and was convicted of stealing iron, for which he spent 4 months with hard labour in Dorchester Jail. He was in Tolpuddle when the Swing Rebellion swept through the country in 1831, but there's no evidence that he was involved in the smashing of threshing machines or the burning of ricks in protest at the desperately poor wages at that time. 2 years later, he joined the union being formed for farm workers to resist even further pay cuts. By this time he was married to Harriet with a young son, George. On an early morning in February 1834, he was arrested along with the 5 others. He was charged with administering an unlawful oath at a meeting he never actually attended. It was James's younger brother John who was at the meeting, which had been held in the upstairs room of Thomas Stanfield's house. But James said nothing to deny this charge, and was sentenced along with the others on the 15th of March 1834 to 7 years' transportation to Australia. Reverend Thomas Warren, who had baptised and married James, had betrayed them in the courthouse, and James must have felt this keenly. Only a year earlier, he had baptised George, his son. Aged 22, James was described as 5 feet 7 1/4 inches tall, blue-eyed with dark brown hair and a fair complexion. James and his wife Harriet must have feared they'd never meet again. Many convicts didn't survive the ordeal or ever return home. It's said that her cries were heard across the village on the morning of the arrest. James arrived in Port Jackson in Australia in September 1834 after a 5-month horrific voyage on the ship Surrey, and was assigned like a slave to Edward John Eyre, a 19-year-old British landowner, to look after a flock of 400 sheep at Woodlands Farm near Queanbeyan, some 10 miles from what we now know as Canberra. He'd have known nothing of the massive campaign going on in the UK to free the 6 men. All across the country, workers signed petitions and held meetings, and tens of thousands of people marched to London to deliver the petition to Whitehall. It was borne on the shoulders of 12 unionists, and was taken to the office of the Home Secretary, Lord Melbourne, who hid behind his curtains and refused to accept the massive petition. The campaign eventually won their pardons, which were granted in March 1836, and 5 of the 6 returned home in 1837. But James's freedom was delayed due to a charge of assault on a guard in Australia. There had been many changes in the 5 years James had been in Australia. His mother had died, aged 49, only 18 months after he left, and his father had remarried. Also, England had a queen, young Victoria. The others had returned 2 years earlier, and the Dorchester to London Committee, who had won their freedom and supported the families in their absence, had now leased 2 farms for them in Essex. James eventually set sail for home on the ship Eureka on the 8th of March 1839, arriving back in the UK in August 1839. On September the 22nd, a grand reception was held in Victoria Theatre, now the Old Vic, in London. Emotions ran high, and even the leader of the martyrs, George Lovelace, an accomplished public speaker, found it difficult to speak to the large cheering audience. Alone among the martyrs, James Hammett didn't write of his experiences. He'd had a hard life, but James was to outlive 3 wives, 5 children, and 4 grandchildren. In 1875, the National Agricultural Labourers Union led a strike of farm workers. Employers in Dorset responded by sacking and evicting union activists. A large rally was held in Bryant's-Puddle, and James was invited as the guest of honour. The great leader of agricultural workers, Joseph Arch, presented him with an engraved silver watch, 10 gold sovereigns, and an illuminated address. The words of the address paid tribute to James and the Tolpuddle Martyrs, but also attacked local landowners for their treatment of their workers. In his old age, he is believed to have run a night school for children in Tolpuddle. He lived opposite the parish church, but with his sight failing, he opted to enter the Dorchester Union workhouse rather than burden his niece, and that's where James died, on the 21st of November 1891. In 1934, the TUC commissioned the radical sculptor and typeface designer Eric Gill to make a new headstone for James. It was unveiled by George Lansbury, the leader of the Labour Party.
They fought for something which was to be of benefit not to a few of their class, but the whole of mankind. Every child in the land to have an equal opportunity to a God-given life.
Since then, with a few exceptions, there have been wreath-laying ceremonies every year to honour James and his comrades.
James Hammett was the only one of the Tolpuddle Martyrs who was buried here. And also, perhaps in those few moments, remembering that when he was buried, the squire turned up to make sure that no one said anything in favour of trade unionism. A few moments of silence while we respect their memories and rededicate ourselves to what we have to do. Thank you.
Thank you, Norman.
I still have to pinch myself to believe that this brave man was my grandfather. His story has already been passed on to my children and grandchildren, and I know they'll continue telling the story of the enigmatic loner, James Hammett, our grandfather and our hero.
I lay this wreath on behalf of the Methodist Church and in memory of all the Tolpuddle Martyrs. Their determination to bring better working conditions for agricultural labourers made such a difference and brought the freedoms for which they longed.
I lay this wreath on behalf of St John's Church here in Tolpuddle, where James Hammett's grave is found. As we remember the martyrs, we remember a small group of men who made an enormous difference to the world. They would never have believed that we are still remembering them today, and they are a great reminder that though we may not think we can make much difference by ourselves, it only takes 3 or 4 people to join together to make an enormous difference that can change lives and bring justice for generations.
My name's Tony Gould. I'm a resident of this village and a branch secretary of a local union and originally a member of the Agricultural Workers Union. So I'm pleased to lay this wreath today on behalf of the trade union movement and the people who live in Tolpuddle and the National Union of Agricultural Workers. The Tolpuddle Martyrs were not, of course, the very first trade unions, but what the TUC is celebrating here is the campaign to have them returned from Australia, where they were savagely and unjustly sent as a result of belonging to a trade union, and they were returned at the state's expense with a pardon. There have been many such claims before, never successful, and that's in a way the first successful claim by the trade union movement. So I'm very happy to lay this wreath, remember George Lovers and his colleagues and comrades today.
On behalf of Tolpuddle Martyrs Cottages, I lay this wreath remembering all the hard work you did for the workers. And on behalf of Oliver Trippett, I lay this wreath.
As a member of the Hammett family, I lay this wreath today from James Hammett's grandchildren and descendants, and all the Hammett relatives, and also all the relatives of the other martyrs that went off to Canada.
So now, as we reflect on the legacy of James Hammett, George Lovelace and the other martyrs, we go over to our good friend Graham Moore with Tolpuddle Man.
Farewell to my family, it's now I must leave you. That far fatal shore, in chains we shall see. Although we are taken, do not be mistaken. As brothers in union, we shall be free. They can bring down our wages, starve all our children, they can bind us, steal all our land. They can mock our religion, from our family divide us, but they can't break the oath of a Tolpuddle man. To those who rule us, we are the dissenters. Do your duty, be thankful, don't complain, we are taught. For God in his wisdom divided his kingdom, for few to have much, while so many have naught. They can bring down our wages, starve all our children. In chains they can bind us, steal all our land. They can mock our religion, from our family divide us, but they can't break the oath of a Tolpuddle man. As brothers together, with an oath we will bind us. The labouring poor in all England shall rise. Though Frampton has framed us, they never will tame us. Arise, all you Britons, we'll yet win the prize. They can bring down our wages, starve all our children. In chains they can bind us, steal all our land. They can mock our religion, from our family divide us, but they can't break the oath of a Tolpuddle man. Help me out now. They can bring down our wages, yeah, starve all our children. In chains they can bind us, steal all our land. They can mock our religion, from our family divide us, but they can't break the oath of a Tolpuddle man. No, they can't break the oath of a Tolpuddle man. Thank you for joining in. I heard you. And the birds.